everybody. Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. Today I want to talk to you about technology hype and the technology bubble we've been living in for the last decade or so. And I'm going to do that by outlining an article I wrote with the technology and innovation scholar Jeffrey Funk titled Blinded by the Hype, which appeared in the new online science and technology magazine Open Mind. I want to thank Jeff for working with me. I've respected his work for a long time, and you should check him out. Before we get started, I think we should put this conversation in context. I'm recording this video at the end of July 2022, and Jeff and I published the piece in June. Now, there was an enormous run-up in global, but especially US stock markets during the COVID-19 pandemic, but for several months now, air has been coming out of that bubble. Tech stocks are way down, as are cryptocurrencies and other garbage. Companies are laying people off. Startups are having a hard time getting initial public offerings and are taking on lots of debt. And firms like Google and Facebook are experiencing decreasing ad revenue and are projecting a recession. But numbers are also mixed. Americans are spending a lot of money, which is not what you'd expect in a recession, and hiring is still strong in the US economy. Now, it could be that the market bottomed out in June and we're already on a way to recovery, or it could be that we've just reached a plateau before a lot more value is lost in markets. If I had to bet, I'd say there's going to be more pain in the future, but frankly, no one knows what's happening in markets and the economy right now. So predict whatever you would like. But regardless of whether markets have already hit bottom and we're now in recovery mode, I think we can say for sure that for the past decade or so, we have been living in a technology bubble in which technology companies have been overvalued from their actual worth. There has been an incredible amount of hype, and by hype I mean unrealistic projections of near-term technological change around things like AI, big data, you remember big data? Robotics, drones, self-driving cars, smart homes, virtual and augmented reality, and blockchain. In many ways, our current bubble was born from the ashes of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. In 2013, USA Today named what we now know to be the perennial loser of a firm, Uber, to be the tech company of the year. And soon thereafter, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee published their book, The Second Machine Age, arguing that society was on the verge of a technological revolution fueled by robots and AI, which would lead to incredible payoffs of economic growth, but potentially also troubling job loss. Frightening. Well, according to economic data, that's just not how things have turned out. The hype of the past decade really outpaced the technological improvements on the ground. And I think there's a tendency to say, look, that's just how bubbles work. We had one before during the dot-com era, which ended with a bust, and we're just going through a similar cycle again. But what Jeff Funk and I argue is that actually no, especially when compared to the earlier dot-com bubble, our bubble is different because it is fundamentally unproductive. We have been living in an unproductive bubble. The technologies of our moment are not paying off the way earlier ones did, and we can show this in a number of ways. Now, before we get started with that showing, though, I think we need to talk about why people adopt technologies in the first place. Well, one huge academic literature that deals with this topic is the so-called technology acceptance model. One of the central articles in this literature has been cited nearly 26,000 times, which, believe me, is a lot. The technology acceptance model says that people adopt technologies when two things are true. First, what they call perceived usefulness, that is, people think that technology will help them, whether that's to help them do their job better or like look hot or cool. It doesn't really matter. Second, perceived ease of use. That is, people don't want to put in a lot of effort. If it's too hard, why bother? I'm lazy. Over the last 200 years, since the rise of the so-called Industrial Revolution, our society has adopted an incredible range of technologies. And maybe the most important thing these technologies have allowed us to do is increase efficiency. That's the ratio between how much work we put in and what we get out. We call this increase in efficiency productivity. Now, we can talk about how productivity is measured in another video, but for now, I just want you to keep in mind that the version I'm going to talk about, which is called total factor productivity, is a measure of how changes in technologies and organizations have improved economic output. This brings up the first bit of evidence that our current technology bubble is different than the last one. And here I'm going to be drawing really heavily on Robert Gordon's book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which you should check out. It should be required reading, I think. What Gordon shows is that the US economy experienced a high period of productivity growth between the 1920s and the 1970s. Then productivity hit the skids in the 70s. The 70s sucked. Then productivity went back up, though not as high as the period before the 70s, from roughly 1994 to 2004. Then it went back down again. And though this chart cuts off in 2014, with brief exceptions, total factor productivity has remained low ever since, right up to today. Now, this period from 1994 to 2004, it was the dot-com era. At the time, it was called the new economy. It was a moment when Americans were adopting personal computers and the internet. And people were using things like Microsoft Office, groundbreaking, and PDFs. And companies were adopting basic and extremely boring systems like customer relations management and enterprise resource planning software. And yes, this period was a bubble. It ended with a bust, but it also involved people changing the way they did things in ways that increased productivity. And this has just not been true of our bubble of the last decade. Productivity has not been high. And shit, lots of things that have gotten really popular and made money over the last decade, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and Pornhub, have probably actually decreased productivity because frankly, we're messing around when we should be working. But let's say you're like, well, estimating productivity is hard and complicated and I don't really believe in it. Well, then Jeff and I give you two other reasons for believing that the bubble of the past decade is fundamentally different than ones that came before. And they are market size and profits, and I'll take them one at a time. Market size is the total revenue possible in a given economic sector. If the sector is large, it will have a large market size. So for example, I saw one estimate that the global automobile manufacturing market in 2022 is like $3 trillion. That is huge. What we see when we look at market sizes of technologies that emerged in the 1990s is that they were growing quickly and getting big fast. In 2020 dollars, to keep things simple, by the year 2000, e-commerce had reached $446 billion. Internet hardware and software had reached $315 billion and $282 billion, and mobile service revenues had reached $230 billion. So just to focus on e-commerce for a second, there definitely was a bubble around e-commerce, and e-commerce companies died by the drove during the bust. It was like a bloody massacre with stabbing and blood flying everywhere, gore, the whole works. But there was also real change happening. People were buying things via e-commerce. It's a real shift that gave us mega corporations like Amazon. That is not what we see when we look at technologies hyped in the last decade. Here's a chart from an article Funk and I published in 2021. The numbers have changed a bit since, but not by a lot. Keep in mind the $400 billion market size for e-commerce in 2000 and look at these numbers. AI, $17 billion, VR, $16 billion, commercial drones, $6 billion, blockchain, $1.9 billion. For shits and giggles, I looked up the market size for the metaverse today and found it was $500 million, not billion dollars, million. In terms of technology markets, the metaverse is nothing. And here's a link to a video I enjoyed on how the metaverse does not exist. Again, if people think technologies are useful, they will buy them. But although lots of people have been buying into the hype around these technologies, market sizes show they haven't actually been buying them when compared to the last bubble. This is also clear when we look at profits. If people buy the shit a company's selling, the company brings in revenue. If the revenue coming in is larger than the cost going out, you have profits. But Jeff Funk has shown that about 90% of today's big startups are unprofitable and have lost more than they've earned over their existence. And there's lots of famous examples. Uber's like $30 billion in debt, Lyft, indebted, often unprofitable, delivery apps like Grubhub and DoorDash, unprofitable, full of debt. At one point, Spotify was like $3 billion in debt. The list goes on. So something is amiss. Even though there's been a lot of hype around this set of technologies I've talked about today, they are not paying off, and so far they aren't greatly improving our economy. In another video soon, we'll talk about why this matters. Spoiler alert, it has to do with poverty and human suffering. We'll also talk about why stupid fucking bullshit like Web3, NFTs, and the metaverse aren't going to help. And we'll talk about some factors that may have contributed to the creation of our unproductive bubble. I hope to see you then.